Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our Great Political Fictions series, we're moving on from science fiction to another genre, spy fiction. I'm going to be talking about a novel which is not the best-known novel by its author, and its author's reputation is not what it was. It's Graham Greene's The Human Factor, published in 1978. Despite that, it is a fascinating book. And it is a fascinating book in part because of what it has to say about the politics of loyalty, the politics of betrayal, and political evil. 40 years ago, in the 1980s, towards the end of his life, Graham Greene was a really big deal. I remember it, and indeed I remember his death. His death was a huge event. He was one of the towering figures in English-speaking literature. He was a best-selling writer, and he was also highly respected. He had his critics, many critics, but he was taken really seriously. In the time since his death, that has changed, I think. I don't know how much people still read Graham Greene, but I get the feeling not nearly as much as they used to. One of his novels snuck in to the recent Guardian list of the 100 greatest novels of all time. I was surprised, actually, that any of his were in there at all. The novel is The End of the Affair, which is probably the one of his that still gets read the most, not least because it's one of his very few novels that has a fully realised female character in it. And that is part of the problem with Graham Greene. I think it's part of the reason why he's not nearly as widely read as he used to be. He feels out of time. The kinds of novels that he wrote aren't fashionable anymore. They're very masculine. They're not macho. They're the opposite of macho, but they are masculine. They're about men. They're about a certain kind of man. The Graham Greene character is a very distinctive kind of fictional creation and recurs across his many novels over decades. Usually middle-aged, world-weary, often an Englishman abroad, a little lost, not usually a bad person. The lead characters in his books tend not themselves to be wicked, but they encounter wickedness and it brings them down. They don't know how to deal with it. They are men who have trouble with women. And one of the themes of Greene's books, it recurs in too many, I think, it's fair to say, is the story of an Englishman abroad falling in love with a local woman, a white man in a relationship with a non-white woman. And that's what brings about the trouble, not because it's not love, it often is love. But the love drags the Englishman into a world that he doesn't really understand, and he ends up often doing something bad as a result. They are novels about guilt, about betrayal, about sin, and that's the other thing about them. They are very much Catholic books. He was known as a Catholic writer. The book that made his reputation in many ways, Brighton Rock, which when I was at school was on all the school reading lists. I don't think you could do an exam without coming close to having to read Brighton Rock. I would be amazed if it's on those lists now. I think Graham Greene has basically, certainly in the English exam world, been entirely replaced by Ian McEwan. Where people used to read Brighton Rock, they now read Atonement. I reread Brighton Rock recently, and I was surprised by not how bad it was, because in some ways it's still an amazing book, but how overwritten it was. It was and is. It's very melodramatic, and it is shot through with very Graham Greene Catholic themes: mortal sin, the terror of hell, what it means to be, as they call it in Brighton Rock, a Roman in England. And those themes run through a lot of Graham Greene's books. Many of his characters, many of these world-weary men, these decent or decent-ish men who find themselves caught up in sin, are Catholics, and the Catholicism is part of what makes their predicament for them so agonizing. Graham Greene's novels are also political, and some of the politics is dated too. He was, after the Second World War until his death, I think quintessentially a Cold War writer. The last two novels I talked about in this series are also quintessential Cold War books in their different ways. The Golden Notebook it's a novel about the Cold War, the early Cold War, about 56, about Hungary, about leaving the Communist Party. The Dispossessed, as I said in our recent episode, it's a Cold War book. It's about Vietnam. It is a Vietnam-era work of science fiction. The novel I'm going to be talking about today, The Human Factor, but pretty much all of Greene's novels from the late 1940s onwards, from indeed the other thing that he wrote in the late 1940s, about which we also did an episode with Misha Glenny, the screenplay for The Third Man, the definitive early Cold War movie. They are about a world divided between the Americans and the Russians, the capitalists and the Soviets, with the English, the British, caught in the middle. And again, Graham Greene novels, they're a little samey. That's part of the problem. There's a slight feeling when you've read one, you've read them all, because the tropes recur. In Graham Greene world, or Greenland, as it used to be called, the Americans are not to be trusted. The Americans aren't the worst people in the world, but Americans allow the worst things in the world to happen. The Americans have the fatal sin of idealism. They are naive. In the best known of those novels, The Quiet American, it is a naive American who does the worst damage of all in the way that the Americans did in Southeast Asia. He lets evil flourish because he doesn't know that his ideals are compromised. Never trust the Americans because they think they're doing good in the world. That's a Graham Greene theme. On the other side, the Soviets, the Russians in Graham Greene books, they're not the good guys by any means. They're no better than the Americans. But they know they're no better. They are soulful in Graham Greene novels. You'd much rather spend the evening getting drunk with a Russian in a Graham Greene novel than you would spend the evening eating a hamburger with an American. The Russians are soulful. The Americans are brittle and frightening. These are the people who rule the world between them. And the English, the British, are caught between, living on past glories. A lot of the action takes place in outposts of what was, and in some respects still is, when Greene is writing The British Empire. But it's an empire in decline, it's fading, it barely exists at all. These middle-aged, world-weary English diplomats, civil servants, businessmen, they are out of time. It's part of the reason they have these unfortunate relationships. They're looking for something that's not there for them anymore. Out of time, but also trapped in attitudes that no longer hold. They're often trapped in small English or British enclaves where class still plays an important part. They're trapped in the British class system in a world in which the Americans and the Russians don't care. They find the English way of doing things laughable. The English are at risk because they no longer control a world they still believe is theirs. And they get into trouble because the sense that they have of what they can, what they should, what they ought to do is not in sync with what's possible. All of these features of Greenland, of the world of Graham Greene, are present and correct in the novel that I'm going to talk about today. It is a quintessential Graham Greene novel. It's late, published in 1978, probably the last good book that he wrote, and it is a good book. It's not a great book. I'm not going to make the claim that this is a great work of fiction. It doesn't really belong in a series with the Golden Notebook. But it's a really interesting work of political fiction, and it is a very, very political book. It tells the story of a classic Graham Greene character called Maurice Castle. He's a diplomat. He works in the Foreign Service. He ends up working for MI6. He's on the Africa desk. He has a desk job in London. He's a spy, but he's barely a spy. He presents much more like a middle-ranking civil servant. He only has one unusual characteristic, though for a Graham Greene character, it's not at all unusual. He is a white man, a white Englishman in 1970s England, living in London, in the outskirts of London, in the suburbs, close to the provinces, in a town where he is married to what is probably the only non-white person in town. His wife is black. She is a black South African woman. He met her when he was working in the embassy, the British embassy in South Africa. He fell in love. It was a clandestine relationship because in apartheid South Africa, interracial relationships, let alone marriage, was not allowed. He had to get her out, and effectively she was smuggled out of the country. They came back to England, which is where they live, with their son. He's white, she's black. Her son is blacker than she is, which is the way that we are told in the book, and Castle knows this, that it's not his son. Someone else is the father. But he raises him as his own son, and he loves him as his own son. What makes him unusual is his relationship with his black wife and his black son. In every other respect, in 1970s England, he is a completely conventional character. And there is something tired and world-weary about him. He loves his wife, doesn't much love his work, but he does it in a dutiful way. But the love he has for his wife gets him into deep, deep trouble. One thing to be said for this book is it's not one of his Catholic fictions. That's one of the ways in which it's unusual in the range of Graham Greene's fictions. Castle is not a Catholic. Because it's a Graham Greene novel, it has to have a scene in a Catholic church. And it's a really good scene. And actually, I think it's a fitting scene to appear in Graham Greene's last good book. Castle, we discover, though he is a very reluctant spy and he doesn't present as a spy, is not just a spy, he is a traitor in the sense that he is spying for the other side. Castle, we discover, works for the Soviets. He's a mole inside MI6 on the Africa desk, leaking documents about Africa to Moscow. That's what we discover that he does. And eventually we're told why, and I'll come on to the why. It causes him a lot of grief, a lot of pain, and a lot of anxiety. He's terrified of being caught. He's terrified of being rumbled, and he knows how vulnerable his wife and son would be if he were to be discovered, to be exposed. He is very conscious that without him, they are very exposed in 1970s suburban England. Relatively late on in the book, as his agonies mount, and he's really struggling with the double life that he leads, he has a great urge to unburden himself. He can't unburden himself to his wife. He can't compromise her in that way. He can't unburden himself at work. He has no friends to whom he can unburden himself. He tries to unburden himself to his Russian handler, a soulful man with whom you would very much like to get drunk, called Boris. But Boris can't be relied on either, because he never knows when Boris is going to be there. One day he finds himself walking through the unassuming, drab streets of some part of London, and he passes an ugly modern Catholic church. And Maurice Castle suddenly thinks, well, the one person who's going to have to listen to my confession is a Catholic priest, and I need to unburden myself, even though I'm not a Catholic. He goes in, he waits outside the confessional box. Eventually he takes his place. He starts to talk, and it doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that the priest on the other side immediately twigs that this man is not a Catholic. He doesn't know how to do it. He doesn't know the rituals. And Castle says, okay, I admit I'm not a Catholic, but don't you have to hear my confession? And the man says, no, I don't have to hear your confession. And if you're not a Catholic, this really isn't for you. And Castle is desperate and says, I need someone to hear what I have to say. And the priest says to him, which seems to me almost the perfect line for Graham Greene to go out on. It's the line that marks the fact that in 40 years' time, Graham Greene novels will not be read in the way they were being read in the 70s and 80s. The priest says to Castle, what you need is a psychotherapist. There are people who will listen to you, unburden yourself. You can confess whatever you like. You've got to pay them for it. But you're completely mistaken if you think the confessional box is the place for you. You need the psychotherapist couch. Castle doesn't ever get there, but that's the Catholic bit of the book. It's almost like Greene is signalling this is the end. The reason that I wanted to talk about this novel is that I think it has two characteristics that mark it out and make it a bit different, other than the absence of some of the Catholic themes, from the rest of Greene's work. The novel that Greene published before this, called The Honorary Consul, also an excellent book. His late novels are really among his best, not least because they're quite restrained. They are not particularly melodramatic. The Honorary Consul, another Cold War book, published in 1973, set in a remote part of Argentina. The Honorary Consul is a classic Greene character, a washed-up, drunken Englishman. He's not even a real consul. He's just an honorary consul in a place where there are no British citizens, so he has no job to do in the backwaters of Argentina, which is itself an extremely troubled place to live, but he ekes out a life for himself. And of course, being a Greene character, he falls in love with a local girl. Not only is she not white, she's also a prostitute, just to rub it in. He and his friend, a doctor who's half Paraguayan, half English, get caught up in a terrorist plot. The plot involves terrorists who include a man who was a Catholic priest and has given up his vocation in order to pursue justice through violence because he believes in the end the church is not doing enough for the oppressed. The terrorist plot goes horribly wrong. It turns into farce. A lot of the second part of the book involves the Catholic priest saying he will not give mass, and people around him who think they're going to die demanding mass and absolution and confession from him. It's a Graham Greene novel in every which way. It's a really good book, but the human factor is different. And it has these two qualities that I think make it stand out even from that one published 5 years earlier. The first is that I think it's less dated, and it's less dated for one very specific reason. Greene said of The Human Factor, a novel about MI6, a spy novel, that he wanted to write a book about MI6 that was in some ways the opposite of James Bond. He wanted to show that these men, and the women too, but the women barely feature, who work in this world, in this underworld of spies and spycraft, are just like you and me, ordinary people, often doing boring desk jobs, just going about their lives, drinking too much, worrying about their mortgages. These are not glamorous people in a glamorous world. These are ordinary people in a fairly squalid world. And that's what he wanted to portray in The Human Factor, which he does. But it goes further than that. It's not just that these are ordinary people in a humdrum world. He also shows the whole thing to be farcical. MI6, as portrayed in The Human Factor, is just a joke. The man who runs it, who's called Sir John Hargreaves, an old aristo, an old Africa hand, is a pompous idiot in his way. His sidekick, a man called Dr. Percival, is even worse. These are schoolboys pretending to be masters of the universe and getting it consistently wrong. The incompetence is everywhere. So these aren't just bureaucrats. They are incompetent bureaucrats. They're more incompetent than your everyday bureaucrat doing your ordinary bureaucratic job would be. And yet these people are in the world of violence and death. And to read this book is to get a glimpse from 1978 of a genre of spy writing, which is now the dominant genre. So this book was ahead of its time. Most of Graham Greene is out of time because it feels like it belongs to a world that no longer exists. This book is ahead of its time because I'm pretty sure, there are probably lots of candidates for this, but I'm pretty sure this is the most specific forerunner of what has become the dominant spy genre in popular culture, certainly in the English-speaking world, and given the way the English-speaking world dominates the televisual world, my guess would be in the world. And that's all down to one series of books, Slow Horses by Mick Herron, the books, and then the TV series, the series starring Gary Oldman, Kristin Scott Thomas. Slow Horses is about MI5, the domestic branch of the British Secret Service, rather than MI6. But in other respects, it is uncannily similar to the world portrayed in The Human Factor. These people are very ordinary. They are incompetent. They are farcically incompetent in many ways. There's nothing glamorous about what's being described in Slow Horses or in The Human Factor. But because of the kind of work they do, when they mess up, when they misunderstand, when they fail to write down the message correctly, when they get hung up on their particular version of interpersonal, inter-office animosity, when the British class system gets in the way, when they're too chippy, when they're simply too dumb to notice what's going on around them, people die. It's like Ricky Gervais's The Office. It's like the world of David Brent. But in that version, the Office version, it's a paper factory and nobody dies. People fall over. They say the stupidest things. They cause offense. We laugh at them. But the worst thing that happens is someone makes a fool of themselves at the office party. In The Human Factor, in Slow Horses, when someone makes a fool of themselves at the office party, it is sometimes the case that as a result of that, another human being is tortured to death. And that's where the humour lies, because it's very dark humour. And The Human Factor is quite a funny book. It's funny in the way that Slow Horses is funny. And part of the humour is that you can't believe that as a result of this or that, this is actually someone being tortured to death. but it is. The version in The Human Factor turns on the discovery by these upper-class twits who run MI6 that they have a mole. So they come to realize that in the Africa section, someone is leaking to the Soviets. And they know this because they have a mole in Moscow. And their mole in Moscow has reported back to them that the office in Moscow is getting classified documents from the Africa desk of MI6 in London. So Hargreaves, the head of MI6, and his sidekick, the doctor, Dr. Percival, decide that they need to flush out whoever it is. And it's not complicated because part of the farce here is that there are only two people on the Africa desk, Castle and his sidekick, a young man called Davis. It's got to either be Castle or Davis. It could be their boss, but it seems unlikely that it's their boss. So the field is at maximum 3, more likely 2. So they just have to decide which of the two is it. They get a man called Colonel Daintree to investigate, to dig in. Colonel Daintree is not upper class. He is middle class, and class really factors into this. He's slightly ill at ease with the instructions that he's been given. He's awkward in the presence of his superiors, but he's a stiff upper lip, stick in the mud, decent British officer who wants to do his duty. And his duty is to work out, is it Castle or is it Davis who's leaking the secrets? When it's decided which of the two of them it is, then these men have to decide what to do about it. We're in the 1970s. The thought is that the British secret state has had enough spies to be going on with. First, there was Burgess and Maclean. Then there was Philby. Actually, a year or two later, the fourth man, Anthony Blunt, was going to be exposed. There is a sense that MI6 is a leaky sieve, and most of its secrets find their way to Moscow. So even though everybody knows the stuff that's being sent from the Africa desk by these middle-ranking, ordinary chaps doesn't really make any difference to anything. If the press get hold of the idea that there's another mole inside MI6, they'll have a field day with it. It has to be stopped. You can't run a secret service and simply allow your secrets to be handed over to Moscow, but nor do they want any publicity. So the first task is to identify which of the two men it is. And then the second task is to eliminate the problem. And it's decided between Percival and Hargreaves that the best way to eliminate the problem once they worked out who it is to kill that person. And in a slightly excitable schoolboyish way, the doctor decides that he's got the perfect means of doing it because there's a way in which you can allow toxins to build up in peanuts, and then if you feed the peanuts to the man's liver will fail within a week. Percival also decides that the mole is not Castle, it's Davis. And he decides it's Davis for a few reasons. Davis is a bit rackety. He leads a slightly drunken life. He's a young bachelor. There are copies of Playboy lying around in his flat. He gambles a bit on the horses. He's in love with the secretary in his office. He meets his secretary for lunch in London Zoo. Isn't that the sort of thing that a spy might do? And there's also a hint that what Percival really wants to do is to bump one of these two off using peanuts. And for the plan to work, ideally, the person who's going to die should be someone who drinks too much, because if he drinks too much, then they can pass it off as cirrhosis of the liver. It turns out that actually of the two, Castle is the one who drinks too much. Castle, when he comes home every night, has a quadruple whiskey and then another one, but Castle doesn't drink at work. The reason Castle doesn't drink at work is that Castle is the mole. Castle is the one handing the secrets to the Russians. Castle knows that it wouldn't do him any good to be known as the office drunk. He is the office drunk. They don't know it. Davis is not particularly drunken. He's actually just a slightly hopeless character. But they decide that it's him, and so they do kill him. They do poison him with peanuts. He does die a terrible, agonizing death, alone, tortured. And then they do try and pass it off as cirrhosis of the liver, not particularly successfully, because he sickens and dies within a week, and he's a relatively young man. And most people, even without medical knowledge, have this feeling that cirrhosis takes a bit longer than that. And was he really drinking that much? It is pure farce. These people are the sort of buffoons that you get in any workplace. Ideas above their station, trying to be too clever by half, so caught up in office intrigue that they can't actually see the wood for the trees, they can't see the spies for just the incompetence. But because of the world that they're in, because of their kinds of mistakes, people are tortured to death. And it's funny. Davis's funeral is sad and funny. Davis's death, which is horrific, is sad and funny in the same way that in Slow Horses, if you read or watch Slow Horses, people die the most terrible deaths. And it's funny. In James Bond novels, people die the most terrible deaths. It's not funny. It's just part of the background noise. It's part of the bang wallop of the whole thing. This is like Slow Horses. And this is how we now think of that world. Not because of Graham Greene, I think because of Mick Herron. When we think of MI5, MI6, I think the dominant mode is to think this is what these people are like. It is more like David Brent than it is like James Bond, but it's David Brent with poisoned peanuts in his pocket. And it is the English, the British secret state, completely out of time, playing a game it doesn't understand in a world where it doesn't understand the stakes because it is no longer in control of the stakes, fighting for an empire that went long, long ago, living on past glories. David Brent in that world is an absolute menace, and it's true in this novel too. I think this novel is funnier than most Graham Greene novels. It has a great scene in it, which turns on the English class system. When Daintree first comes to interrogate Davis and Castle, doesn't get anywhere. His idea of interrogation is to say to them, "You're good chaps. Would a good chap be a spy?" And they both say, no, no. So he doesn't really know what to do. But he's in a panic anyway, because he's been hired for this job by Hargreaves, and Hargreaves wants to debrief him. So he's been invited to the Hargreaves country estate for a shooting weekend. Daintree's the wrong class for that. He's too middle class, he doesn't shoot, doesn't really know what the etiquette is. We're told he has no small talk. He's terrified. He's far more terrified of this shooting weekend with Lady Hargreaves and her husband than he is of the Russians, than he is of anything. And his big fear is that he doesn't know what to bring as a gift. That's the thing that's really keeping him awake at night. As he finishes interrogating Castle, Castle says he has to go, but he's got to go and pick up something for his son, his young son, Sam, who's been sick at home, and he's promised to get him some Maltesers. For people who don't know, I know we have an international audience. Maltesers are a chocolate sweet, honeycomb covered in chocolate. They are not a luxury item. They are available everywhere, and they're cheap, and they're quite nice. Daintree has never heard of Maltesers, and the word sounds to him exotic, and he asks what they are, and he's told they're honeycomb-covered chocolates, and he suddenly decides his problems are over. That is, of course, the perfect gift to bring for Lady Hargreaves. He doesn't understand what Maltesers are, so he has no idea what the quantities should be. He doesn't understand that you get lots of them in a square red box. He ends up with a crateful of Maltesers that he takes to Sir John and Lady Hargreaves for the shooting weekend. Lady Hargreaves greets him and is presented with more Maltesers than she or anyone knows what to do with. She's posh, Daintree isn't, so she keeps a stiff upper lip and tells him what a jolly original present that is. But in the twist that I think makes the joke perfect, she then puts them out for lunch in silver salvers round the table when all the hunting chaps are stuffing their faces before going out on their shoot. The hunting chaps, all of these posh men, are basically schoolboys. They're schoolboys in grown-up clothes. Sir John Hargreaves is a schoolboy. Dr. Percival is a schoolboy. They're schoolboys with poison in their pockets. That's what makes them so terrifying. Because they're schoolboys, when they see on the table silver salvers full of Maltesers, it turns out to be the greatest gift Daintree could have given anyone. Not just original, but they're thrilled. They bounce in their seats with excitement. It's like being back at school again. They're going to have Maltesers for pudding. It's a dark, dark comedy. It's funny. It's funny in the way that Slow Horses is funny. But there's something else that makes it different. And this is where the politics comes in. Unlike Greene's other books, which are all in their different ways about evil, including political evil itself is often somewhere off stage. So, for instance, in the preceding novel, the honorary consul, set in Argentina, there is a figure of real evil brooding in the background, but he never appears in the book at all. We only hear about him at one remove. We hear tales of the things that have happened on his watch, but we don't encounter him face to face. The evil in that book has a name. It's Alfredo Stroessner, the dictator of Paraguay, the man on whose watch Paraguayan prisons and police stations become torture chambers in which people are tortured to death. He's there in the background in a very Graham Greene touch to all of his Cold War novels. The Americans are dangerous because they're naive. The Russians are to be trusted because they're not naive. The English are out of time and out of their depth. But the really bad stuff is not done by the Americans or the Russians or the English. It's done by the bit part players in the Cold War. The really terrible stuff in the honorary consul is happening in the jails and the police stations of Paraguay. Such terrible things that they can't be described. The Americans, the British, and even the Russians in their way are the enablers of that. They are the enablers of evil. And it is being the enabler of evil, which is what Greene is interested in. He's much more interested in the enabling of evil and what it does to a decent person to know that the evil in the world is there because of them, despite their best intentions, than he is in writing evil itself. Evil characters are less interesting, I think he thinks, than the people who allow evil to flourish. But in the human factor, we meet evil face to face. The most evil character, I would say, in all of Greene's fiction appears in this book because he is uncompromisingly evil. He has absolutely no human qualities at all outside of the fact that he is the worst that a human being can be. And he is a South African secret policeman. His name is Cornelius Muller, an Afrikaner, South African secret policeman, a racist, essentially a fascist, a genocidal monster, and he is terrifying in this book. The scenes involving Cornelius Muller are not funny at all. Muller appears in the book for two reasons. He is part of Maurice Castle's backstory. When Castle was in South Africa and fell in love with his wife Sarah, a love affair across racial lines, it's Muller who tries to stop them leaving the country. If Muller gets his hands on Sarah, both Maurice and Sarah know that Sarah will die, and die a terrible death in South Africa's jails. He gets her out. He escapes Muller's clutches. Muller is a bogeyman from his past, a terrible figure. He's the devil, essentially, but the devil was left behind in South Africa, and now they are living a provincial, suburban, blameless, uneventful life in England. And Muller comes to find them there too. And the reason Muller comes to find them there is not because he is still trying to track down Castle and Sarah. Castle and Sarah are long gone. Muller is there because he's been invited there by the American and British secret establishment. Muller is there because the Americans and the British, doing what the Americans tell them, but also because they have their own interest in this, have decided, we're in 1978, that in that context of the Cold War, they need to redouble their relationship with the apartheid regime. That is, they need to strengthen it, they need to make it more cooperative, and they need to bring the South Africans into their secret circle. Castle discovers that for the first time in many years, something big is happening on the Africa desk. Because they have, they think, Rumble Davis as the spy, Castle is the one they trust. Castle is handing secrets to the Soviets. They tell Castle that it is his job now to work on something called the Uncle Remus operation. And the Uncle Remus operation is a secret agreement between the British, the Americans, and the South Africans to share intelligence, share resources, share military equipment, share weapons of destruction, because their interests are now mutually reinforced. There are two reasons why the British and the Americans want to bring the South Africans in. One is because this is the Cold War, and in Greene's version of it, anything and everything must be done to stop people falling into the hands of the communists. There's a fear that South Africa, which seems to be on the brink of a race war, could be also on the brink of a revolution. And if there's a revolution in South Africa, the communists win. So the revolution has to be suppressed. The British, the Americans have to help the apartheid regime suppress it. The blacks have to be kept down. Also, because the British and the Americans have extensive business interests in South Africa. And here's where the British have their own interest. Under Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, one of the reasons that Margaret Thatcher was very, very resistant to attempts to sanction or ostracize the apartheid regime is she understood full well how extensively many different British business interests depended upon the South African regime for their prosperity. We're in 1977, 78 in this book, so we're pre-Thatcher, but we're definitely not pre that world and that understanding of why South Africa matters. So this is a grubby deal. The apartheid regime is evil. Everybody knows that it's evil. Mullah is a terrible human being. Sir John Hargreaves wants nothing to do with him. Dr. Percival wants nothing to do with him. They fob him off onto Castle, partly because Castle is an old South Africa hand, partly because they know, everybody knows, Castle has a black South African wife. So Muller's going to have to behave himself a bit. And in the worst scene in the book, and by worst I mean the most uncomfortable to read, the most chilling, Castle and his wife Sarah have to host a dinner for Cornelius Muller, because Cornelius Muller is now an honoured guest of the British government, and it's Castle's job to butter him up. He doesn't butter him up, but he does have him in his home with his young black son upstairs, a wife and a son that Muller would like to kill. And we know Muller would like to kill them because one of the things that Castle discovers is that Muller has been making some secret visits to places including West Germany and letting people have a glimpse of the secret agenda of the South African state. One of the things that the South African government wants American and British resources to help to deliver, and that's genocide. Muller is a Nazi, and he wants to eradicate the native races of his homeland. He wants them herded into places where they can be killed. And in a secret recording, he lets slip, slightly inadvertently, just how far along that thinking is inside the South African secret establishment. And Castle gets to hear it. Castle gets to hear that this man who wanted to kill his wife when he was trying to get her out of South Africa wants to kill her and their son again, along with all black South Africans. And this then becomes Castle's dilemma. Castle is a very reluctant spy. Castle does not belong in a series of tales about converts to communism. He is not spying for the Soviets because he's a communist. He is not a communist, which is one of the reasons why he makes quite a good spy. He is spying for the Soviets because he is a decent English chap, and he is grateful to the communist who helped smuggle his wife out of South Africa, a communist whom he subsequently discovered died in terrible circumstances in the jails run by Cornelius Muller and his fellow thugs in BOSS, the South African secret security operation. Because the communists did Castle a personal favour, the communists were the only people who could help him and Sarah get out. He feels he owes them. And because it was known that he would feel that he owed them, the debt was called in. The debt was called in by the Soviets, and they have ever since asked Castle simply to pass on the occasional document from the Africa desk, which is what he's been doing. But he's had enough. And just before he is briefed on the Uncle Remus plan, the new bringing in of apartheid South Africa from the cold, he has decided to retire. He is not going to give secrets to the Soviets anymore. He doesn't see the point. He's not sure it's made any difference or done any good. He feels he has repaid his debt. He's never had a secret of any value or any worth. Nothing happens on the Africa desk. This is the 1970s. The empire doesn't exist anymore. The British are incompetent and under-resourced. The country is practically bankrupt. The sort of stuff that passes under Castle's nose is barely worth the paper it's printed on. But he still smuggles it out of the office, gets it into the format of a secret code, hands it over to Boris, gets it to Moscow. Enough, he's finished. And just after he's decided he's finished, he gets a secret that is worth something. In fact, he gets a secret that he can't keep to himself. He can't not tell the Russians about Uncle Remus. He can't simply brush under the carpet the fact that the British and American establishment are now going to enable South African genocide. This is too bad. It's evil. It's not politically evil. It's not anti-communist. It doesn't threaten the balance of power in the Cold War. It's not going to lead to the defeat and the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's simply evil. And it's not evil in the way that in many Greene novels evil is framed, a mortal sin. It's just the worst thing that human beings can do because Cornelius Müller is the worst human being of them all. And it should be said, Cornelius Müller is a fully fleshed out character in this book. Greene portrays him convincingly and well. He has a sense of humour. There's nothing funny about him, but he has a sense of humour. He has quite good manners. He is shrewd. He knows how to read another person. He behaves himself when he comes to dinner with Morris and Sarah. He behaves himself, and by behaving himself, he scares them more than if he had kicked off. He is a very well-rounded character, and he is the devil. I think it's one of the best portrayals of the devil in this kind of political fiction. And so Castle is trapped in the classic way that Graham Greene characters get trapped. Decent, middle-aged, world-weary men trying to do their best, in love with a woman who leads them into a world in which they are not at their ease. And in that world, discoveries are made that cannot be kept secret. But when they are exposed, the discoverer will be destroyed. And that's what happens to Castle. He hands over the secrets about Uncle Remus to the Soviets. And he does it in a way which means his cover is blown. There is no way, now that they've killed Davis, that they won't know it's Castle. So Castle has to be got out. The thing that Hargreaves and Percival didn't want happens in this novel. Suddenly, Maurice Castle is the fourth man. He's smuggled out in somewhat farcical circumstances. He's got to Moscow. He's set up in a flat. He is now there with Philby and Burgess and Maclean, though Burgess is dead by this point. They're not named, but they hover in the background of this book. He is another one of those spies, yet he was never one of those spies because he was never a believer. When this book came out, and subsequently, even recently, because there's been a recent book about this relationship, there was a lot of speculation as to whether Greene was actually writing here about Philby, Kim Philby. As we mentioned in the conversation with Misha Glenny about The Third Man, Greene and Philby knew each other very well. Philby was the third man. He was named as the third man in the House of Commons in a very different sense from the sense in which that term is applied to Harry Lime, Orson Welles. Greene and Philby worked together. Greene and Philby worked together in MI6 during the Second World War. Greene left the service of MI6 and left working for Philby. Some people think because he twigged that Philby was a Soviet agent. Other people don't think that Greene twigged that. When Philby was exposed as a Soviet agent, Greene maintained his relationship with him. It was a real friendship. And given who Graham Greene was, I don't think Graham Greene would be the sort of person who would need the smelling salts if it turned out that one of his friends had been spying for the Russians. Far better for the Russians than for the Americans. Philby was got out, in his case from Beirut, to Moscow. Philby was set up in a flat in Moscow. Philby was given a fake job to do in Moscow. Philby eked out his days in Moscow, apparently wanting the cricket scores from London and smuggled in copies of the Times. A sad life. Did he or did he not regret what he did? We don't know. But one of the people you might know is Graham Greene, because Graham Greene went to visit Philby towards the end of both of their lives. In the mid-1980s, he went to see him in Moscow and to talk through their relationship. That's the subject of a recent book, the lifelong friendship, connection, understanding between Graham Greene and Kim Philby. Greene himself suggested that he had the plot and the materials for The Human Factor a lot earlier than he actually published it. He published it about a decade after it was ready to be written. It was a 1960s book. that he ended up publishing in the late 1970s. And one of the reasons that he waited is because he didn't want people to think that this was a novel about Kim Philby. He wanted enough years to have passed. And the setting makes it very different. This is about apartheid South Africa. And by the time he ended up writing it, one of the things that Greene really wanted to convey was his horror at the complicity of the American and British states in what was going on in 1970s South Africa, where the evil was. Just as actually in The Honorary Consul, the real fury is the complicity in the regime of Stroessner. It's complicity that drives Graham Greene mad with rage. Cool rage, ironic rage, world-weary rage, but my God, it thrums through these books. He hates the things that the British and the Americans allow. You feel like he hates it more than he hates the things that they are allowing. But in this book, unlike in The Honorary Consul, he allows that second hatred to come through too. Just the pure hatred of men like Cornelius Müller from Boss. But he didn't really need to worry that people would mistake Maurice Castle for Kim Philby, because this is not that story. And one of the reasons I think this is such an interesting book, one of the reasons it's a haunting book, is that this is not that story. It does not belong in a set of stories about communist spies. Philby was a communist. Philby was converted to the cause, the creed. He believed in it. Did he carry on believing it when he'd been stuck in his flat in Moscow on his fourth wife in the 1970s and 1980s in his nonsense job as a hero of the Soviet Union, but basically eking out his days pointlessly in a country that he must have been able to see was slowly falling apart? Did he still believe that the communism that he had fallen in love with in the 1930s was the future? Who knows? But in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, he was living it. During the Second World War, he was at the heart of events. Philby had a very, very serious part to play. He was not just passing over nonsense information. He was passing over information on which the war turned. He may have been responsible for delaying the end of the war to give the Soviets enough time to conquer Eastern Europe. Many, many people were tortured and died because of Kim Philby. No one in this novel, as far as we're aware, suffers anything because of the information that Maurice Castle hands over. Philby was not a regular, ordinary, mid-ranking bureaucrat. Philby was a risk-taker. Philby was a drunk. Philby was a womanizer. Philby was not to be trusted for anything. Philby was not hiding his spying under a respectable exterior. Philby was hiding his spying under such a rackety exterior that no one could possibly believe that he would get away with it if he really was a spy. Castle is the opposite. Castle seems completely respectable because he is completely respectable. Castle loves his wife. Castle loves his son even though it is not his biological son. Castle is to be trusted, which is the reason why it's Castle's co-worker, to use a contemporary term, who ends up poisoned to death with the peanuts. They can't see Castle for what he is. But the key thing about Castle is that he is not a believer. He's not spying for the Soviets because he believes that the Soviets are on the side of right. He's spying for the Soviets because they once did him a favor and he wants to pay his debts. And his debts are not political. They are purely personal. There is no ideological component to the actions that he undertakes. And that, in a way, is the reason why he ends up trapped. If it's ideology, if it's faith, political faith, religious faith, if you have a higher cause, it's easier to compromise, or at least sometimes it's easier to compromise. There are trade-offs that can be made in the name of the higher cause. You can see the bigger picture. You can sometimes persuade yourself that in order for good to prevail, evil must be done. You can certainly persuade yourself that if you're Kim Philby. Maurice Castle can't think like that because that's not the kind of person that he is. He's just a decent, hard-working, world-weary, slightly sad bureaucrat who loves his wife. And his wife is only alive because of a favour that he thought he was done by a decent man in South Africa who happened to be a communist. And that is his only link with the cause for which he is spying. And it's because he's not an ideologue, because he doesn't have a creed, because he doesn't have a faith, because for him it is purely personal, that he can't compromise. He can't get past the evil when he encounters it. If you're Kim Philby, you have to get past the evil every day because you are enabling evil to be done all the time. But you're telling yourself it's in a higher cause. Castle is not enabling evil to be done. We don't see Castle involved in the business of evil at all. Hargreaves is the enabler of evil. Percival is the doer of evil. He's a poisoner of innocent men. Muller is evil. The Americans hovering in the background are the presiding spirits of evil in the world, in Graham Greene's understanding, not because they are evil, but because all of the evil that is allowed happens on their watch, because they are not paying attention, because they are too busy eating hamburgers and making money and pretending that they're making the world safe for democracy. All of that happens, but that's not Maurice Castle. He is an innocent in that world. So when he encounters evil, when he hears Muller on the tape saying that the plan in the end is to exterminate the black peoples of South Africa, when he looks at his wife, when he looks at his sleeping child, he realizes there is nothing he can do. He's going to have to reveal the secret, which means he's going to have to blow his cover, which means he is going to be exposed as a Soviet agent, which means he will be misunderstood. And when he is exposed as a Soviet agent, his mother, among other people, is so horrified that she will never forgive him. He is a traitor. He will be condemned as a traitor. In his own mind, he's not a traitor. In his own mind, he's just a decent man trying to do the decent thing. But evil flushes him out because he can't live with it. He can't find any way of living with it. He does not want to hand the information about Operation Uncle Remus over to the Soviets. But he has to because he has no choice. In a classic Graham Greene sense, the decent man has no choice but to destroy himself. Not in this case because he's a Catholic. In this case because he's just so ordinary, but he's not bad. He's not good, but he's not bad. A decent human being under those conditions finds himself trapped. And he ends up in Moscow leading a Kim Philby life. In his flat, with nothing to do, he discovers that he has been a pawn in a game he didn't understand. When he gets there, he finds the reason why he's been asked all these years to hand over these pointless, ridiculous, inconsequential secrets from London to Moscow. The people in Moscow didn't want to find out what was passing through the Africa desk in London. They couldn't have been less interested in that. They simply needed secrets from London to arrive in Moscow, so that the man that the Americans and the British thought was their mole in Moscow could hand those secrets back to his masters in London and Washington to confirm his bona fides. Look, I've discovered that you've got a mole in the Africa desk, because that man was a double agent. He was actually working for the Soviets, pretending to work for the Americans. So all Castle was a kind of stooge, providing pointless information that was being used to establish the bona fides of a mole in Moscow who was not a mole. He was actually playing it both ways. Castle's irrelevant to this story. It could have been anyone. He was returning a favour to people who weren't interested either in the favour or in Castle. He's just part of a game he doesn't understand. He arrives in Moscow believing in nothing, having nothing, no faith to lose, and nothing to live for, because the reason he did all of this was his love for his wife. Sarah, his wife, is not a particularly fleshed out character in this book. Like many women in Graham Greene novels, she's a bit of a cipher. But she serves the purpose of establishing that for Maurice Castle, all of this is personal. He's not doing it for political reasons, he's doing it for personal reasons. The word for why he's doing what he's doing is not ideology or faith. It's not a political belief system. It's not a creed. The word is love. He's doing it because there are two people in the world that he loves, and Cornelius Muller wants them dead. So a non-political man working on the Africa desk of MI6 in what is essentially a non-political role because it's a joke job in a joke organization that has no idea about how the world works anymore. A non-political man in a fake political world gets dragged into the world of pure power politics and ends up in a flat in Moscow, having lost the only thing that he believed in. The only thing he ever believed in was his relationship with his wife and his son. The Soviets tell him that they will bring Sarah and Sam, his wife and his son, to join him in Moscow. But when he gets to Moscow, he realizes this is not going to happen because they won't be able to get them out. And so he's lost the only thing that he believes in. It is, and Graham Greene specializes in bleak endings. The ending of this book is as bleak as any of them. And in a way, it does have a political message. And it's a political message, I think, which in some ways has not dated and is not out of time and is in keeping with the spirit of Graham Greene's fiction. And it's one of the reasons why Graham Greene's fiction remains worth reading. The political message of this book is that for non-political people, politics is the death of love. Before we go, producer Helen and I, just want to say thank you for the many, many, many messages that we get about this podcast. We've had a lot of messages about this series on great political fiction, suggestions, ideas. As I've mentioned a few times, some of these episodes have come out of the suggestions that we got last time we talked about some of my favourite political novels. We're enormously grateful. It is just the two of us. We don't, unfortunately, have time to respond to all the messages we get, but we want to let you know we do read them all and we do really value all of your suggestions. So do keep them coming in. Do follow us on Blue Sky at PPF Ideas if you'd like to keep up to date with what we're doing. And as always, you can find out everything you need to know about this podcast at our website, ppfideas.com. A reminder that there is a new bonus episode out on PPF Plus in which I'm talking to Luke Kemp about the most recent of the political fictions that we discussed, Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, and exploring with him the ways in which the ideas of a stateless world, an anarchic world, a Leviathan-free world in Le Guin's science fiction imagination maps on to the real historical story Luke tells in his book, Goliath's Curse. If you'd like to get that episode, all of our bonus episodes, past, present and future, 2 every month, ad-free listening, automatic sign up to our newsletter, never have to hear me, give you this message again, click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com. Next time, it's the penultimate of this set of great political fictions. It's not exactly a fiction. It is a completely miraculous book. It's Annie Ernaux's The Years. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.